The sound of shattering glass echoed through the master bedroom. A porcelain medicine bottle rolled across the polished marble floor, scattering tiny white pills beneath an antique dresser. "You miserable old woman." Vivian Crawford's perfectly manicured hand lashed across Lucia Moretti's frail face, with enough force to send her sideways in her wheelchair.
"I've spent 3 years pretending to adore you,"
she hissed, grabbing a fistful of the elderly woman's silver hair. "In 4 days, I'll be Mrs. Moretti. This mansion, this fortune, this family, every bit of it, will belong to me." The housemaids stood frozen. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor. No one dared move. No one, except Sophie Bennett. Ignoring every warning that flashed through her mind, the curvy young maid rushed forward and wrapped both arms around Lucia just as Vivian's second slap sliced through the air. "Please stop," Sophie pleaded. "She's ill." Vivian slowly turned, her cold smile widening. "So the maid thinks she's family now." Neither woman noticed the tiny black camera hidden inside the carved wooden clock above the fireplace. Nor did they realize that every trembling word, every blow, every act of cruelty was streaming live into a reinforced surveillance room buried beneath the estate. There, surrounded by dozens of glowing monitors, Massimo Moretti sat perfectly still. To the entire world, the ruthless Mafia boss was already halfway across the Atlantic on an emergency business trip. Private jet, passport stamps, airport security footage. Every detail had been carefully staged. Because 4 days before his wedding, one question had begun to haunt him. Did Vivian truly love his mother, or had she only been performing whenever he was watching? He had expected small complaints, perhaps impatience, maybe annoyance. He had never imagined he would witness outright abuse inside his own home. As another insult spilled from Vivian's lips, Massimo's fingers tightened around the edge of the steel desk until his knuckles turned white. Years of surviving gang wars, betrayals, and assassination attempts had taught him how to hide every emotion, but nothing had prepared him for watching his helpless mother cry while the woman he intended to marry smiled with satisfaction. Then Sophie did something no one else dared. She stepped fully in front of Lucia. "If you want to hurt her," she whispered, her voice shaking but unwavering, "you'll have to go through me first." For the first time in years, Massimo Moretti felt something far more dangerous than rage. He realized the greatest enemy threatening his family had never been outside his gates. She had already been living inside his home. The surveillance room beneath Moretti Manor had never been built for family matters. It existed for war. 3 feet of reinforced concrete separated it from the rest of the estate. Military-grade monitors covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Every hallway, every entrance, every garden path, every bedroom occupied by key family members could be viewed in crystal-clear detail. Massimo Moretti had ordered its construction after surviving his 3rd assassination attempt 6 years earlier. Only 4 people knew the room existed. Massimo, his chief of security, Marco Santini, the estate's cybersecurity director, and the architect who had designed it, who had mysteriously disappeared less than a month after construction. No outsider had ever entered. Tonight, however, the room served a completely different purpose. Massimo wasn't hunting rival syndicates. He was searching for the truth. He leaned forward in his leather chair, his dark eyes fixed on monitor 12. The image showed his mother's bedroom. Vivian still stood over Lucia, her expensive designer heels planted beside the overturned wheelchair. Sophie remained between them, her arms spread protectively. Marco broke the silence. "Boss." Massimo didn't answer. "I can have 6 men upstairs in less than 30 seconds. Still nothing. The veins along Massimo's jaw tightened. "No." Marco frowned. "But she's assaulting your mother. I know exactly what she's doing." His voice was frighteningly calm. If I stop this now, I'll only catch her once. He looked back at the monitor. If I let her believe she's safe, she'll reveal everything. Marco had worked beside Massimo for nearly 15 years. He had watched the man negotiate million-dollar arms deals without blinking. He had seen him order executions with less emotion than most people used ordering coffee. Yet he had never seen his employer grip a chair tightly enough to bend solid steel. Upstairs, Vivian slowly released Lucia's hair. The elderly woman's breathing had become uneven. Her oxygen tube trembled against her cheek. Vivian crouched beside her. "You know what I need." Lucia turned her head away. "I'll never sign." Vivian smiled patiently. "You still think your son will protect you? He always has." The old woman's voice was barely audible. Vivian laughed. "He protects his empire. He doesn't have time to babysit a sick old woman." She reached toward the bedside table. Instead of handing Lucia the bottle of heart medication, she picked it up, turned it upside down, and poured every tablet into her own handbag. Sophie gasped. "What are you doing?" Vivian didn't even bother looking at her. When people refuse to cooperate, they lose privileges. Lucia's breathing became noticeably faster. "You can't do that," Sophie whispered. "She needs those pills." Vivian finally turned. "You've worked here, what, 3 years? 4. And somehow you still think servants are allowed opinions." Sophie swallowed hard. She knew exactly who Vivian was. The future Mrs. Moretti. The woman every employee had been instructed to obey. Arguing with her meant unemployment, possibly much worse. But when Sophie looked down at Lucia's trembling hands, fear stopped mattering. She stepped closer. "Please give her the medicine." Vivian tilted her head. "You really are stupid." Without warning, she shoved Sophie backward. The younger woman stumbled into a side table, knocking over a porcelain lamp that exploded across the hardwood floor. The crash echoed through the room. Several housemaids standing outside instinctively flinched. None entered. Everyone had seen enough over recent months to understand one rule: never interfere when Vivian lost her temper. Inside the surveillance room, Marco muttered a curse. "She's escalating." Massimo remained motionless. Zoom. An operator immediately enlarged the bedroom feed. Now, every facial expression filled the screen. Every trembling tear, every heartbeat of fear. Massimo noticed something he had somehow missed before. This wasn't Lucia's reaction to a single terrible afternoon. It was recognition, expectation. The old woman wasn't surprised. She looked accustomed. His stomach twisted. How many times had this happened while he attended meetings in New York, Chicago, Las Vegas? How many business trips had unknowingly become opportunities for cruelty? The realization landed like a knife. Vivian had never hidden from the staff. She had hidden from him. Upstairs, Sophie slowly stood. Blood trickled from a small cut near her elbow, where broken porcelain had sliced her skin. Vivian glanced at it dismissively. "Oh dear. You should be more careful." Sophie ignored the pain. She walked directly toward the older woman instead. Kneeling beside Lucia, she carefully gathered the scattered medicine from beneath the dresser. Only 3 pills remained on the floor. The rest were inside Vivian's handbag. Sophie held out the tablets. "I'm sorry. It's all I could find." Lucia's hands shook too violently to hold them. Without hesitation, Sophie poured a glass of water and gently helped the elderly woman swallow the medication. Vivian watched with narrowed eyes. "You just disobeyed me. I helped someone who was suffering." "No." Vivian smiled coldly. "You challenged me." Silence filled the room. Then Vivian reached into her handbag again. This time she removed a thick, cream-colored folder. Several legal documents slid onto the bed. Massimo immediately leaned forward. Marco did the same. "What are those?" Vivian tapped the signature line with one manicured fingernail. "You'll sign these today." Lucia stared. "No. You haven't even read them. I don't need to. They're lies." Vivian's smile disappeared. "You really should read before making accusations." Lucia looked directly into her eyes. "I know exactly what they are. They're the third version. The first two failed." Every muscle in Massimo's body became perfectly still. Third version? His gaze shifted toward Marco. Marco was already reaching for his phone. Massimo raised one finger. Wait, he wanted to know everything. Every lie, every accomplice, every signature, every betrayal. Because for the first time since becoming head of the Moretti family, Massimo no longer believed Vivian was acting alone. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. Vivian calmly straightened the stack of documents on Lucia's bed, as though she were preparing papers for a routine business meeting, instead of attempting to force an elderly woman into surrendering her family's future. Outside the bedroom door, the housemaids exchanged anxious glances before lowering their eyes again. They had all seen pieces of Vivian's temper. None of them had ever witnessed this much. Deep beneath the mansion, Massimo's surveillance room remained silent except for the faint hum of servers. Marco finally broke the silence. "Boss, should I identify the documents?" Massimo nodded once. Within seconds, one of the cyber analysts enhanced the camera feed. The zoom sharpened the first page, just enough to reveal several familiar words. Moretti Family Trust. Emergency Amendment. Successor Authority. Marco's expression darkened. "Those aren't wedding papers." "No," Massimo answered quietly. "They're succession papers." The room grew colder. Years earlier, Massimo's father had established the Moretti Family Trust, with one absolute safeguard. If Massimo ever died, disappeared, or became medically incapacitated, no spouse could seize immediate control of the family's fortune. Lucia's approval was required. Only his mother possessed the final signature, protecting generations of Moretti assets. Someone had found a way around that protection. Upstairs, Vivian slid an expensive fountain pen toward Lucia. "Sign." Lucia looked at the papers but never reached for the pen. "You forged these." Vivian laughed softly. "I revised them. There is a difference. There is a prison sentence." Vivian's smile disappeared for only a heartbeat before returning. "You always were dramatic." Lucia slowly lifted her tired eyes. "I knew your kindness wasn't real." Vivian folded her arms. "Then why didn't you tell Massimo?" The elderly woman answered without hesitation. "Because I hoped I was wrong." Those words lingered in the room. Even Sophie felt her heart tighten. Lucia had spent years searching for goodness in the woman her son loved. She had continued hoping despite every warning hidden behind forced smiles and polite conversations. Vivian leaned closer. "You know what your greatest weakness is?" Lucia remained silent. "You actually believe people deserve second chances." Her voice hardened. "I don't." She grabbed the documents again. "You have until tomorrow morning. If these papers aren't signed, your private nurse disappears." Lucia frowned. "My nurse?" Vivian smiled. "Evelyn Brooks." Sophie looked up immediately. Evelyn had cared for Lucia for almost 7 years. She was practically family. "You can't fire Evelyn," Sophie protested. "I already did," Vivian answered casually. "I called the agency this morning." Sophie stared in disbelief. "You had no authority." "I'll have complete authority in 4 days." The confidence in Vivian's voice chilled everyone listening. She truly believed nothing could stop the wedding. Massimo watched every second without blinking. His breathing had become almost unnaturally slow. Those who worked closest to him recognized the warning signs. When Massimo became angry, he grew quieter, Never louder. Marco leaned closer. I've never seen her this confident. Massimo nodded. Because someone powerful is protecting her. The answer felt increasingly obvious. Vivian wasn't improvising. Every move appeared rehearsed. Every threat carefully planned. Someone had spent months preparing this takeover. Upstairs, Sophie helped Lucia drink another sip of water. The older woman's hands were still trembling. You should rest, Sophie whispered gently. Lucia managed a weak smile. You always remind me of my daughter. Sophie blinked. I didn't know you had one. Lucia's eyes softened. I didn't. I only wished I had. The words caught Sophie completely off guard. She lowered her head, embarrassed by the sudden sting of tears. She had lost her own mother at 16. Since joining the Moretti estate 4 years earlier, caring for Lucia had never felt like work. It had felt like home. Vivian watched the exchange with visible disgust. How touching. She slowly clapped her hands. The maid wants to become family. Sophie stood. I never asked for anything. No? Vivian stepped closer, until only inches separated them. Then explain something. Why does Lucia trust you more than me? Sophie answered honestly. I never gave her a reason not to. The sentence struck harder than any insult. Vivian's expression froze. Then came the smile. A dangerous one. So that's your game. What game? The loyal caretaker. The innocent servant. The woman everyone feels sorry for. Sophie frowned. I don't understand. Oh, Vivian said quietly. You will. She turned toward the doorway. By tomorrow evening, everyone in this mansion will know exactly who you really are. Without another word, she walked out. Her heels echoed down the marble hallway, until silence returned. Sophie exhaled slowly. Something about Vivian's final words felt wrong. Not emotional. Planned. Lucia reached for Sophie's hand. Be careful. Sophie forced a reassuring smile. I'll be fine. But deep underground, Massimo was already shaking his head. No, he murmured. Marco looked over. What is it? Massimo replayed the final 30 seconds of surveillance. Again and again. Finally, he froze one frame. Vivian's left hand. She hadn't left the bedroom empty-handed. She had quietly slipped something beneath Sophie's housekeeping apron while pretending to walk past her. The object was too small to identify, but it was intentional. Massimo slowly stood. His voice became colder than steel. Marco. Yes, boss? Start recording every camera Sophie passes from this moment forward. Marco immediately understood. Vivian's setting her up. Massimo nodded. And whatever she planted won't be the real crime. He looked once more toward the frozen image on the monitor. No, the real crime hasn't happened yet. It's about to. The next morning, Moretti Manor appeared perfectly ordinary. Sunlight spilled through the towering windows. Fresh flowers arrived from Florence. Wedding planners crossed the marble foyer, carrying fabric samples and seating charts. Chefs discussed banquet menus. Florists measured the grand ballroom one final time. To every outsider, the estate looked like a family preparing for the wedding of the year. Only 3 people knew the truth. Massimo, Marco, and the surveillance team hidden beneath the mansion. At precisely 8:17 a.m., camera 27 captured Sophie leaving Lucia's room with an empty breakfast tray. She smiled politely at every servant she passed. She had no idea dozens of monitors followed her every step. Massimo folded his arms. Don't lose her. Never, Marco replied. Sophie entered the staff kitchen. She washed the breakfast dishes, prepared fresh tea for the gardeners, and spent 20 minutes helping one of the younger housemaids carry heavy boxes into storage. Everything about her routine was ordinary, which made Vivian's threat even more disturbing. If Sophie had been framed, the evidence had to appear naturally. At 9:42 a.m., it happened. Vivian entered the kitchen carrying a jewelry box. She greeted everyone with a warm smile that looked completely different from the woman seen on the hidden cameras the night before. "Good morning, everyone." Every servant immediately straightened. She laughed softly. "Oh, relax. We're practically family already." Massimo stared at the screen without expression. If he had not witnessed yesterday's abuse himself, he might have believed this performance. Vivian walked directly towards Sophie. "I wanted to apologize." Sophie looked genuinely surprised. "For yesterday, I lost my temper." Vivian lowered her eyes with practiced humility. "Wedding stress. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." Sophie hesitated. "It's all right." "No." Vivian opened the velvet jewelry box. Inside rested an antique diamond brooch shaped like a white lily. "It belonged to Massimo's grandmother. I'd like you to polish it before the ceremony." Sophie immediately stepped backward. "I can't." Vivian smiled. "I insist. It's far too valuable." "I trust you." Those 3 words made Marco snort. Massimo said nothing. He simply watched Vivian gently place the jewelry box into Sophie's hands before leaving the kitchen. Exactly 6 seconds later, Massimo spoke. "There." Marco replayed the footage, frame by frame. As Vivian withdrew her hand, her thumb briefly touched the clasp underneath the brooch. Marco enlarged the image. A tiny transparent adhesive strip became visible beneath the velvet lining. "There's something attached." Massimo nodded. "Keep watching." Sophie carried the jewelry upstairs to the housekeeping room. She carefully placed the brooch on a soft polishing cloth before answering another maid's request for fresh towels. The room remained empty for less than 2 minutes. Then another figure quietly entered. Damian Moretti, Massimo's cousin. The same cousin who had helped organize nearly every wedding detail over the past month. Marco narrowed his eyes. "I knew it." Damian looked around to ensure no one was watching. Unfortunately for him, someone always was. He opened the jewelry box, removed the tiny adhesive packet hidden beneath the velvet, then slipped a folded document inside Sophie's housekeeping locker before leaving as silently as he had arrived. The entire operation lasted 23 seconds. Massimo slowly exhaled. "So, it really is Damian." Marco crossed his arms. He didn't even hesitate. "No," Massimo answered quietly. "Because he's done this before." The surveillance analyst immediately searched archived footage from previous weeks. Within minutes, dozens of short clips appeared. Damian entering restricted offices. Vivian arriving minutes later. Locked cabinets mysteriously opened. Financial files disappearing. Security schedules changing. Individually, nothing seemed suspicious. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Marco looked stunned. My God, they've been working together for months. Massimo's expression never changed. No, longer. He opened Damian's personnel file. 16 months. That was when Damian had insisted on becoming coordinator for the family trust's legal restructuring. The perfect position, close enough to manipulate paperwork, far enough to avoid suspicion. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sophie finally returned to her locker. She opened the door. A folded envelope slid onto the floor. She frowned. "I don't remember putting this here." Curious, she unfolded it. Her face immediately lost all color. Inside lay photocopies of confidential trust documents. Several pages carried forged approval stamps. At the bottom rested a handwritten note. "Thank you for agreeing to deliver these papers tonight." Sophie whispered, "What? I've never seen these before." Massimo stood instantly. "She's been set up." Marco reached for his radio. "Should we stop this?" Massimo shook his head. Not yet. He was beginning to understand Vivian's strategy. The forged inheritance documents alone might raise questions. But if the trusted maid caring for Lucia appeared to be secretly transporting confidential financial records, every accusation against Vivian would collapse. Sophie would become the obvious criminal. Lucia would lose the only witness willing to protect her. And Vivian would walk into the wedding as the grieving victim of betrayal. Elegant. Cruel. Almost perfect. Almost. Massimo pressed another button. Bring me every security recording involving Damien and Vivian from the last 18 months. The analysts immediately began compiling hundreds of hours of footage. One technician suddenly froze. Boss. Massimo turned. What? The young analyst enlarged a parking garage recording captured nearly a year earlier. Vivian stepped from her car. Damien approached. Instead of greeting each other like relatives, they embraced. Not politely, not casually, intimately. Then Damien kissed her. The surveillance room fell completely silent. Marco stared at the screen. They're lovers. Massimo didn't answer. He simply watched the recording continue. Vivian smiled, reached into her purse, and handed Damien a thick envelope filled with cash. As the timestamp disappeared from the monitor, Massimo finally understood the full scope of the betrayal. This had never been about marriage, never about love, never even about inheritance alone. His fiancée, and his own blood relative, had been building a conspiracy together while standing beside him at every family dinner, every business meeting, and every holiday celebration. The wedding was only the final move, and unless he exposed them with undeniable proof, the Moretti Empire would become theirs within 4 days. 4 days later, the bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral rang across Manhattan. Television crews lined the entrance. Luxury cars stretched for nearly 2 blocks. Politicians, judges, corporate executives, foreign diplomats. Every influential family connected to the Moretti Empire had gathered to witness what newspapers were already calling the wedding of the decade. No one suspected they had actually been invited to something very different. A public execution, not by bullets, by truth. Inside the cathedral, Father Michael O'Connor stood before the altar, quietly reviewing the ceremony. White roses covered every column. Thousands of candles illuminated the vaulted ceiling. A full orchestra waited beside the choir. Everything appeared flawless, exactly as Vivian had imagined. She stood in a private bridal suite, wearing a custom Italian gown, worth more than many people earned in 10 years. Her reflection smiled back confidently. Damien adjusted his tuxedo beside her. We're almost there. Vivian laughed. No, we're already there. She glanced toward the massive diamond engagement ring. In 30 minutes, Massimo's empire belongs to us. Damien lowered his voice. And the old woman? Vivian shrugged. Once the trust is transferred, Lucia becomes someone else's problem. Neither of them noticed the tiny smoke detector above the dressing room mirror. It wasn't a smoke detector. It was another hidden camera. Every word streamed directly into the surveillance command room. Marco looked toward Massimo. They're confessing. Massimo calmly pressed record. Keep everything. Across the cathedral, Sophie quietly helped Lucia into the front pew. The elderly woman looked weaker than she had only days before. Despite receiving proper medication again, the emotional wounds remained. You don't have to stay, Sophie whispered. Lucia gently squeezed her hand. I've spent too many years watching people wear masks. Today, they finally come off. Sophie forced a smile. She still believed Massimo was somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, racing home for his own wedding. She had no idea he was already inside the cathedral, watching, waiting, planning. Exactly 11 minutes before the ceremony, a black limousine quietly stopped behind the cathedral. Massimo stepped out. No photographers, No announcement. Only Marco waiting beside the rear entrance. "You have everything?" Marco handed him a secure tablet. Every surveillance recording. The financial records. The forged documents. The DNA verification on the signatures. The affair. The money transfers. The trust amendments. The attempted framing. The elder abuse. Massimo nodded. And Sophie. She still knows nothing. Good. The orchestra began playing. Every guest stood. Vivian appeared at the end of the aisle. The cathedral filled with admiration. She looked radiant, elegant, untouchable. Exactly the image she had spent years creating. Father Michael smiled warmly. "We are gathered here today." The enormous cathedral doors suddenly opened. Every head turned. Massimo Moretti walked inside, perfectly calm, perfectly composed. Not from an airport, not exhausted from international travel. He had never left New York. Vivian's smile flickered. Only for a second. Then she recovered. "You came home early." Massimo smiled politely. "I've been home all week." The words landed like ice. Damien's face lost its color. Vivian laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" Massimo didn't answer. Instead, he continued walking until he stood directly before the altar. The priest looked confused. "My son. Is something wrong?" Massimo slowly removed his wedding ring from his pocket. He never placed it on Vivian's finger. Instead, he laid it gently across the Bible resting on the altar. "I'm afraid this ceremony cannot continue." The cathedral erupted into whispers. Vivian grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" Massimo looked directly into her eyes. "Showing everyone who you really are." She forced another smile. "I don't understand." "No, you understand perfectly." He nodded toward Marco. The cathedral lights dimmed. Guests looked around in confusion. Then, the enormous projection screen, prepared for the wedding reception, descended behind the altar. The first video appeared. Lucia's bedroom. Vivian's voice echoed through the cathedral. "You useless old witch." Gasps filled the room. Then came the slap. Several women instinctively covered their mouths. Business executives stared in disbelief. The second clip followed immediately, Vivian ripping Lucia's medication away. Then threatening her. Then demanding signatures. Then grabbing her hair. Every camera angle, every insult, every act. Impossible to deny. Vivian's breathing became uneven. "This is edited." Massimo calmly raised another remote. A timestamp appeared, followed by synchronized footage from 4 additional hidden cameras. Every angle matched perfectly. There was no editing. Only truth. Lucia quietly lowered her head. For the first time in years, she no longer had to explain. The cameras spoke for her. Massimo pressed another button. The next recording appeared. Damien secretly placing forged trust documents inside Sophie's locker. Guests immediately turned toward Damien. His knees weakened. "Massimo, I can explain." "Please do." Massimo's voice remained frighteningly calm. In front of everyone. No explanation came, only silence. Then, another recording. Damien, kissing Vivian in the underground parking garage. Passing envelopes filled with cash. Discussing inheritance. Planning the wedding. Planning Lucia's removal. Planning Sophie's arrest. The cathedral became completely silent. Father Michael slowly removed his glasses. "I have officiated weddings for 38 years. I have never witnessed deception like this." Vivian finally exploded. "You were spying on me." Massimo nodded once. "Yes, because something in my heart warned me that my mother was afraid." "You violated my privacy." Massimo looked at her without emotion. "You violated my family." "There is a difference." Security officers quietly surrounded Damien. He took one desperate step backward. Marco intercepted him. "It's over." Damien looked toward Vivian. She looked away. The partnership that had taken 16 months to build collapsed in less than 60 seconds. Then, Massimo did something no one expected. He walked past Vivian, past Damien, past the reporters, until he stopped in front of Sophie. She immediately lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know what else to do." Massimo shook his head gently. "You protected my mother, when everyone else protected themselves." The entire cathedral watched. Sophie looked completely overwhelmed. "I was only doing my job." "No," Massimo answered softly. "You were protecting my family. And that was never your job." He turned toward every guest in the cathedral. "Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding is cancelled. So is Miss Crawford's access to every Moretti asset." He looked toward Marco. "Contact federal authorities. Transfer every recording, every financial record, every forged document. No private settlements. No negotiations. They wanted my family. They can explain themselves in court." As Vivian was escorted from the cathedral, screaming that everything belonged to her, she looked back one final time. Not at Massimo, at Sophie. Hatred burned in her eyes. But Sophie no longer looked afraid, because for the first time since entering Moretti Manor, she was no longer standing alone. 3 months later, spring arrived in New York. The snow surrounding Moretti Manor had melted into rows of carefully tended white roses. For the first time in years, the estate felt peaceful. Not because the danger surrounding the Moretti family had disappeared. Massimo knew enemies would always exist. Peace had returned because the greatest betrayal had been removed from inside the walls. Vivian Crawford now awaited trial on multiple federal charges: financial conspiracy, forgery, elder abuse, attempted fraud, evidence tampering. Damien Moretti accepted a plea agreement after investigators uncovered millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts. His testimony only confirmed what Massimo already knew. Their relationship had begun nearly 2 years before the planned wedding. Massimo never attended either hearing. Some betrayals deserved justice. None deserved another minute of his attention. Lucia's recovery surprised every physician. Without constant fear, without emotional abuse, without the daily stress she had quietly endured for years, her health steadily improved. She still relied on a wheelchair for longer distances, but every morning she insisted on walking a little farther through the mansion gardens, always with Sophie beside her. "You've slowed down again," Lucia teased one afternoon. Sophie laughed. "I slow down because you refuse to." The older woman smiled warmly. "You've been taking care of me for 4 years. You still treat every walk like it's the first." Sophie looked toward the blooming roses. "My mother always said, the people who need kindness the most usually ask for it the least." Lucia quietly reached for Sophie's hand. She raised an extraordinary daughter. Sophie lowered her eyes, embarrassed. No compliment ever made her comfortable. She had never helped Lucia hoping for recognition. She simply couldn't bear watching someone suffer alone. From the library window on the 2nd floor, Massimo watched them. Marco stepped inside carrying several folders. "You've been standing here almost 20 minutes. Massimo smiled faintly. "I know." Marco followed his gaze toward the gardens. "She still doesn't know." "No. When are you going to tell her?" Massimo closed the folder in his hands. "Not until I'm certain." "Certain of what?" "That she believes me because of who I am. Not because of what I own." Marco chuckled. "The most feared mafia boss in America is nervous about asking one housemaid to dinner." Massimo looked completely serious. "I'm terrified." Marco laughed. "I've seen you negotiate with cartel leaders. I've seen you walk into gunfire. I've never seen you afraid. Massimo continued watching Sophie help Lucia sit beneath an old oak tree. I wasn't afraid of dying. I'm afraid she'll say no. A week later, Lucia organized what she insisted was a small family dinner. In reality, it included nearly everyone working at the estate: housekeepers, gardeners, chefs, drivers, security staff. For years, they had quietly protected the family. Lucia believed they deserved one evening as honored guests instead of employees. Long tables filled the ballroom. Ironically, the same ballroom that had once been decorated for Massimo's cancelled wedding. Only now, there were no crystal chandeliers imported for appearances, no television cameras, no politicians. Only laughter, real laughter. Sophie spent most of the evening helping serve desserts, despite repeated requests to sit down. Finally, Lucia gently caught her wrist. Tonight, your family. You don't work. Reluctantly, Sophie accepted the empty chair beside her. Massimo happened to sit across the table. For the first time since they met, neither of them had responsibilities pulling them away. The conversation felt surprisingly easy. They talked about books, favorite childhood meals, the gardens, music. Lucia watched quietly. Every answer made her smile a little wider. When dessert ended, she deliberately stood. I suddenly remembered. I promised Father Michael some homemade biscotti. Marco almost laughed. Everyone understood exactly what she was doing. Within seconds, the ballroom somehow became empty, leaving only 2 people behind. Sophie looked around in confusion. Where did everyone go? Massimo smiled. My mother has never been subtle. Sophie laughed softly. No, I don't think she has. Silence settled between them, comfortable, natural. Nothing like the awkward silence she had expected. Finally, Massimo reached into his jacket. Sophie immediately recognized the small velvet box. Her eyes widened. I'm afraid I should explain before you misunderstand. He opened it. Inside was not a ring. It was the antique diamond lily brooch Vivian had once used as part of her trap. The police had returned it after the investigation. Massimo gently placed it on the table. My grandmother wore this every Sunday. My mother wanted it to belong to the woman who protected our family. Sophie looked stunned. I can't accept something this valuable. You already have. She looked confused. Massimo continued quietly. You accepted it the day you stood between my mother and someone who wanted to hurt her. You just didn't know it yet. Tears gathered in Sophie's eyes. I only did what anyone should have done. Massimo slowly shook his head. No. You did what everyone else was afraid to do. He took a slow breath. I've spent most of my life believing loyalty could be purchased. That respect came from power. That fear kept people honest. He smiled sadly. I was wrong. He looked directly into her eyes. The person who saved my family wasn't my lawyers, or my guards, or my fortune. It was the woman everyone overlooked. Sophie's voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything tonight. Massimo stood. Then, instead of offering expensive jewelry or promises, he simply extended his hand. Would you have dinner with me next Friday? Not as my employee. Not because my mother suggested it. Just because I'd like the chance to know the woman who reminded me what kind of man I wanted to become. For a moment, Sophie simply stared. Then the same warm smile Lucia loved so much slowly appeared. I'd like that. Massimo smiled. It was small, genuine. Perhaps the first completely unguarded smile he had worn in years. Outside the ballroom doors, Lucia quietly wiped away a tear. Marco stood beside her. You planned this. Lucia grinned mischievously. I merely arranged the seating chart. Marco laughed. They're going to be all right. Lucia nodded. I know. Because true love had never entered Moretti Manor wearing a designer gown or chasing a family fortune. It had quietly arrived years earlier, wearing a simple maid's uniform, carrying medicine, offering kindness, and choosing courage when everyone else chose silence. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of Moretti Manor glowed beneath thousands of warm crystal lights. Once, the room had been prepared for a wedding, built on deception. Tonight, it celebrated something far more valuable: truth. The guests were different now. Many of the powerful names who had attended the cancelled ceremony had returned, not because of business, because they had witnessed something rare, a man who had chosen integrity over pride, and a family rebuilt through loyalty instead of fear. Lucia Moretti stood proudly, without her wheelchair for the first dance. Her movements were slow, careful, but every step represented a victory that no doctor had believed possible. When the music ended, she looked toward the stage. "My son," she said with a smile, "I believe you've kept everyone waiting long enough." Soft laughter spread across the ballroom. Massimo walked onto the stage. For one brief moment, the ruthless head of the Moretti Empire looked less like the man newspapers feared, and more like an ordinary son. He looked toward Sophie. She wore a simple ivory evening gown, elegant, graceful, beautiful, without trying to be. Nothing about her had changed except one thing. She no longer walked through the mansion, wondering whether she belonged there. Massimo extended his hand. Sophie joined him. He faced the guests. "A year ago, I believed strength meant never showing weakness. I believed power meant controlling every situation. I believed loyalty could be purchased." He paused. "I was wrong." He turned toward Lucia. "My mother survived because one woman chose compassion." He turned toward the staff gathered near the ballroom entrance. "Our employees remained loyal because they were treated like family." Finally, he looked at Sophie. "And I found happiness because someone saw the frightened son behind the title everyone else feared." He reached into his jacket. This time, it wasn't an old family brooch. It wasn't a symbolic gift. It was a small velvet ring box. The ballroom fell silent. Massimo smiled. "The first time I asked you something, I asked if you would have dinner with me. You said yes. The second time, I asked whether you would allow me to earn your trust. You said yes." He slowly opened the box. "So tonight, I'm asking only one more question." He lowered himself onto one knee. "Sophie Bennett, you saved my mother. You saved my family. And without ever realizing it, you saved me. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sophie's eyes before she could answer. She glanced toward Lucia. The older woman simply nodded with the biggest smile on her face. Sophie laughed through her tears. "Yes, of course I will." The ballroom erupted into applause. Lucia wiped away another happy tear. Marco quietly whispered to Father Michael, "I've seen the boss survive ambushes without flinching. I've never seen his hands shake." Father Michael smiled. "That's because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing love despite it." Massimo placed the ring on Sophie's finger. Then, instead of celebrating with grand speeches, he simply wrapped his arms around the woman who had quietly transformed his life. For the first time in many years, the Moretti Manor wasn't protected by hidden cameras, or armed guards, or fear. It was protected by something far stronger, a family built on trust. Because true love never demanded power. It never chased wealth. It never needed applause. Sometimes, it simply arrived wearing a maid's uniform, holding a glass of water, protecting someone who could no longer protect themselves. And in the end, that quiet act of courage became the strongest foundation any family could ever build. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you had been in Sophie's place? Would you have risked everything to protect Lucia, even knowing it could cost you your job? If you believe that kindness, loyalty, and courage are more valuable than wealth or status, please support our channel by liking this video and sharing it with someone who enjoys emotional stories filled with justice, family, and unforgettable twists. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next dramatic story of love, betrayal, redemption, and hope. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.